Shalom, everyone. With the gap between Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael, Baruch Hashem, closing, I thought it would be appropriate to talk about both Parshas Matos and Masei, with the Tzipor's permission. It's an idea I wanted to share. It might be an obvious idea that people have heard before. If anybody has aros, also would love to hear. There's a very famous story at the end of Parshas Matos of the Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven, where they approach Moshe Rabbeinu and ask to stay on the other side of the Yarden so that they could receive their chelak there. And there are several famous questions asked on this story. I wanted to focus on two. One is in terms of Moshe Rabbeinu's response to the Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven. Now, we'd expect Moshe Rabbeinu to respond by giving them musar for not desiring to go into Eretz Yisrael. After all, this is Moshe Rabbeinu, the man who begged to be allowed to enter Eretz Yisrael, who was broken over the fact that he was not allowed to enter into Eretz Yisrael. And that's not what he says. Moshe Rabbeinu, in his response to the Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven, says, how can it be that you'll sit here while your Acheichem Yavu L'Melchama V'atem Teshuvu Po? And he says, you're going to turn away Klal Yisrael's heart. You're like the Meraglim. You're going to turn them away from wanting to go to Eretz Yisrael. They'll be nervous, and that's a terrible chait. But he never seems to give them musar over their lack of desire to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Another famous question that's asked in this parsha is that after they come up with an agreement, the Tanai Bnei Gad Bnei Reuven, where they agreed to go forward and fight, Moshe Rabbeinu gives them chalakim in the Eiver HaYarden, and he also arbitrarily chooses Chati Shevet Menashe and gives them a part of the Eiver HaYarden. They were never a part of the party that approached Moshe Rabbeinu in the first place, and it's unclear why Moshe Rabbeinu decided to give part of the Eiver HaYarden to Menashe. That question, I guess, is compounded by two very famous Rashis, where Rashi, by the story of bnosei, in Bamidbar Parashat Zayin, he famously says the pasuk deliberately attributes the yichus of the bnosei to Mishpachas Menashe ben Yosef, all the way back to Yosef. And Rashi explains, why did we need to be told that? Obviously, Menashe is the son of Yosef. Rather, Yosef chive b'sa'aretz, and so too the bnosei chive b'sa'aretz. They carried on the spiritual character trait of Yosef, of being mechaviv Eretz Yisrael, and so too the bnosei loved Eretz Yisrael, Lama Nigara Shem Avinu, and they express that trait, and that shows the tzidkus of the bnosei in their desire for Eretz Yisrael. If you look at the end of Parshas Masei, when the same Shevet Menashe and the same Mishpacha from Shevet Menashe comes forward to Moshe Rabbeinu to complain about the potential possibility of them losing the chelek by bnosei marrying out of the Shevet, out of the Mishpacha, again, the pasuk uses the same formulation of beyond telling me Menashe, it goes all the way back to Yosef, which it's a slightly different formulation, mishpachos, and it could just be connected to bnosei, but it sounds like it's the same connection, that Shevet Menashe had this spiritual trait of the love of Eretz Yisrael that was already given over to them from Yosef HaTzadik. And the question is, why force half of a Shevet that loves Eretz Yisrael and desperately wants to be there to the Eiver HaYarden? Okay, these are questions that have famously been asked. I wanted to suggest maybe a little bit of a radical answer, might be a davar pashut, but I wanted to suggest, based off psukim and many midrashim, that I'll try to give some of the proofs, is that the Eiver HaYarden was always destined to be a part of Eretz Yisrael, maybe not of the same status as Eretz Yisrael proper, but was always intended to even be the chelek of Reuven and Gad, and potentially even Chati Shevet Menashe. And that was always destined to be their chelek. If you look at Moshe Rabbeinu's response to Bnei Gad Bnei Reuven in Parashat Matos, "V'lama tziniunas leBnei Yisrael me'avor el haaretz asher nasan lahem Hashem." Why would you turn the hearts away from the hearts of Bnei Yisrael away from the other side of the Yarden, the land that Hashem gave to them, not to all of you, but to them? Perhaps indicating that the other Shvatim were Moshe Rabbeinu was concerned because they belonged on the other side of the Yarden, but not necessarily Reuven and Gad. Okay, let me share some sources I think that do prove this from the sources of Chazal in particular. There's also another very famous Rashi in Bamidbar Parashat Aleph, in the story of the Sefer Machamos, in the description of Klal Yisrael traveling in between the Nachal that borders between Eretz Moav and the Amorim. And Rashi and Chazal famously tell the interpretation of that Shira, that it refers to the Be'er bringing up the Dam Ve'evarim of the Amorim who tried to ambush Klal Yisrael when they were traveling through that valley. Rashi tells us a fascinating story. The Amorim were hiding in the Harim on their side of the border. And again, this is the border of Moab and the Eretz Amorim. I'm not a geographical expert, but I'm fairly certain that that's on the Eiver HaYarden, not in Eretz Yisrael proper, on the other side. And as they're traveling through Bnei Yisrael, they were ready to ambush Bnei Yisrael to deal great damage to them, chas v'shalom. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu conducted a great miracle. Came in Shabbat Yisrael La'avor. As soon as Klal Yisrael were coming close, Nizdazea Har Shel Eretz Yisrael. Rashi quotes from Chazal. The Har of Eretz Yisrael started shaking. This is a Har that's on the Eiver HaYarden. Kishifcha Yotzas Nahakva Pnei Gavirta. Like a maidservant who goes out to be makabel, to greet her master. And it's, I think, clear from the formulation of Chazal here, as the Harim famously come together and kill the Amorim inside, that these Harim were destined to be a part of Bnei Yisrael. This is long before the conquest. This is before the conquest of Eretz Yisrael v'og. And nonetheless, already the Harim anticipated the coming of the Gvirta, of their master, Bnei Yisrael, and Chazal referred to as a Har Shal Eretz Yisrael. Just another two small rayas. There's a famous Gemara Brachos that describes the Isser of Loeg the Rush. And there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Chia as to whether Mesim, those who have already passed away, are aware of the events that transpire Ba'olam Hazeh. At the end of that Gemara, on Daf Yud Chesed Beis, towards the bottom, the Gemara describes that Rabbi Yonasan retracted his position based off the following. He said, how do we know that Mesim speak to each other? Tells a story, that the Gemara says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu that he should go and say to the Avos, after Moshe Rabbeinu passes away, he should go to the Avos and tell them, the Shvuah that I swore to them, I already was Makai. Moshe Rabbeinu should tell them that. Now, it's an obvious question. It's a little strange for Moshe Rabbeinu to be the one who delivers the news that the promise has been fulfilled. Moshe Rabbeinu, the one who's not allowed into Eretz Yisrael proper, who is not allowed to engage in that conquest. Maybe Yoshua would have been a more appropriate messenger for that delivery of that message to the Avos. And yet, it's specifically Moshe Rabbeinu who HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells to say that. And the Marsha already alludes to this. I think, it seems that Chazal are saying, as the Marsha notes, that already Eretz Yisrael v'og was considered Bichlal Eretz Yisrael, and that was already considered to be a partial kiyum of the Shvuah. And it was as if the conquest has already begun, and as if it was already on its way, and it was already appropriate for Moshe Rabbeinu to deliver that message to the Avos, that the conquest has begun, the Shvuah will be fulfilled, already has partially been fulfilled, and will be fully fulfilled. Okay? And the last small raya from the beginning of Parashat Devarim that we'll be reading next week, in Parashat V'eschanan, that we'll be reading soon, where famously Rashi says, V'eschanan al Hashem be'esahi le'mor, where what's the esahi? At what particular time did Moshe Rabbeinu choose to daven to Hashem? And Rashi says, specifically after the conquest of Sichon v'og, what we spoke about at the end of Parashat Devarim, that's the Misi Shemahut or Neder. I thought, says Moshe Rabbeinu, maybe it's possible that the Neder was lifted. Maybe I actually would have a chance to enter into Eretz Yisrael. The implication, again, being that somehow the beginning of the conquest of Sichon v'og, Eretz Sichon v'og, was considered a partial entry into Eretz Yisrael. Already, even before potentially the Reuven and Gad asked for it as a part of their chelak, already Moshe Rabbeinu anticipated a potential change in plan, that he was, if already he was in Eretz Yisrael, at least partially. Now, it's obvious that Eretz Yisrael proper has even more in store, which is why Moshe Rabbeinu still begs to be allowed into the land. But based off these rayas and maybe some others, I was thinking that it's possible to suggest that the land of Eretz Yisrael was always destined to be for Reuven and Gad, and potentially even Chatzi Shevet Menashe, which is why Moshe Rabbeinu arbitrarily gives it to them. The reason why Moshe Rabbeinu formulates it as if the Eiver, the other side of the Yarden, besides the Eretz Yisrael is intended for the other Shvatim of Klal Yisrael, and why Chazal referred to it as Eretz Yisrael in these various different mamarim that we brought down. I would love to hear anybody's thoughts, and if they have any rayas neged or any rayas for. Have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos.